In this presentation, we're going to be going over Michael Porter's 5 forces and relate it to our discussion on market structure. And with market structure, you got to put market structure in a broader context. And the context that I like to put it in is the market environment. So the market environment has market structure in it. Market structure is simply the level of competition you find yourself within an industry. Another element in the market environment is how businesses, firms behave within that industry. Now, behavior could be something as simple as how they dress, ties or t-shirts, or how often do they do customer surveys? How much does a company dedicate to research and development? These are all examples of conduct, behavior within an industry. And the final element in the market environment is performance. Now, performance can be measured in many different ways. Obviously, a very good way of measuring performance is the level of profit in an industry, but you can measure it in terms of market share, revenues, reputation. There are many ways of measuring a company's performance. Now, when you put all of these three together, this is sometimes called the SCP model. S for market structure, structure S. C, conduct, and P, performance, SCP. And the SCP model basically tells you that when one element changes, this creates a feedback loop. In other words, it affects another element, which affects another element. In other words, you cannot change one portion of the market environment without changing the others. So this basically is kind of a circular nature to this whole approach. Now, Michael Porter, a Harvard Business School professor, basically came up with his 5 forces, and these are 5 things that could tell you how attractive a market is. And market structure is a very important part of the 5 forces. So what I want to do is I want to cover each of the 5 forces, 5 things that say something about the level of competition or the attractiveness of an industry. So let's look at it. Now, before we get into it in particular, you have to understand that this is simply a tool that really helps you understand what you will see in a particular industry in terms of attractiveness or competition. So what you're really looking for is not what the level of competition you find yourself in now. The 5 forces tells you something about the future competition. So in other words, it's forward-looking. It's not really assessing what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future. It's kind of a SWOT analysis. What are the threats? What are the opportunities down the road? So let's look at the 5 elements here. And let's first take a look at bargaining power of suppliers. This has something to say about the attractiveness of an industry. And basically, here you can assess how easy it is for suppliers to drive up costs. So you're a business, you have suppliers, there can be some factors that could cause your costs to go up because of the power your suppliers have over you. Now, what are some of the key factors here? Well, it can be driven by the number of suppliers of each key input. In other words, if there are a few suppliers of your inputs, the potential for them raising prices is higher. The uniqueness of your product or service. So in other words, if your product is not very unique, that means there can be many types of suppliers open to you. If you have a very unique product line or service, you may be limited to only one supplier of a key resource. Or the there's the strength and control over your company. This issue has a lot to do with, let's say, supply chain. If you are someone who has very good, tight control over your supply chain, you can limit the influence suppliers have over your costs. If you're doing a lot of subcontracting, that means you are really giving a lot of power over to suppliers of your product. Then there's the cost of switching from one to another, from one supplier to another. If the costs are very high from switching, that gives the supplier of a key input to you a lot of power. So the next thing we want to talk about is the bargaining power of buyers. So here you could ask yourself, how easy is it for your customers to drive down price? So the previous one, how easy is it for suppliers to drive up costs? Now, how easy it is for buyers to drive down price? Again, some key factors that could affect this, the number of buyers. If you've got a lot of buyers for your product, their power is limited. Fewer buyers, it's higher. So the importance of each individual buyer to your business. If you've got one big buyer, for example, 80% of your sales go to Costco. Costco has a lot of bargaining power over the price of your product. Then there's the cost of switching from one product to another. So in other words, if it's very, very high cost switching for your customers, they have limited bargaining power. For example, I am a heavy user of Microsoft and a lot of their Office products. So there's huge costs for me to switch over to another Office suite. And as a result, I would be susceptible to higher prices that Microsoft charged me. Now, let's look at threats of substitutes. So this basically is affected by the ability of your customers to find a different way of doing what you do. For example, if you supply a unique software product that automates an important process, people may substitute by doing the process manually or outsourcing it. If substitution is easy and viable, then this is a weakness of your power. Now, some key factors here: small number of purchases. I'm sorry, I have a problem with this particular bullet point. These are two bullet points in one. Small number of buyers and purchases of large volumes. So basically, if there are a small number of buyers of your product, the threat for substitution is very high, or it's very great to you. If your small number of buyers switch, your business could be in big trouble. Same thing goes for purchasing of large volumes. If you have a customer that purchases large volumes from you, if they switch, the threat to your business is grave. Then switching to another product is simple. So if there's easy switching from one product to another, obviously this is a greater threat to your business. The product is not extremely important to the buyers. They can do without the product for a period of time. This could be some types of luxury goods are not life and death for a buyer, as opposed to necessities, which they do need. Customers are price sensitive. So if the good is relatively price elastic, these are the types of customers that are willing to look for a better deal, and they are quick to switch to a product if there's a slight price drop in the product. Now, let's look at threat of entrants. So basically, how easy is it for somebody to hop into your market, or in some cases also to hop out? So your market power is also affected by the ability of your future competitors to hop in. So in other words, are there barriers to entry to keep people out? So some factors that would make it easier for people to enter your market, well, cost little in time or money to enter your market and compete effectively. So in other words, if there aren't any high fixed costs to hop in, there isn't any sort of skill set needed to compete with you, then you've got some potential competitors down the road. There are a few economies of scale in place. In other words, size doesn't matter. You don't need to invest large sums of money to start up your business. Your company has little protection of key technologies. In other words, if you're using open source software, for example, this is something that's not proprietary. Somebody else could use it. So if you're doing a good job in using this, let's say, open source software, there's nothing stopping from somebody else from doing it. Now, the last thing is competitive rivalry within an industry that can affect the level of competition you face within an industry. Well, we've discussed some of these in class. Some of the things that can affect it, obviously, how unique is your product? If you're producing a homogeneous good, then the competition is going to be fierce, and there's going to be a little pricing power that you have over your rivals. The number of competitors you face. Obviously, with perfect competition, there are many, many competitors, and with monopoly, there is only one. Now, in oligopoly, there could be many, many competitors, but 3 or 4 have control over most of the market share. Then, of course, the capability of each firm in this industry. There may be quite a few competitors, but if one firm is just more capable in terms of producing a good or service, then that gives them a unique advantage. I mean, a very good example would be Apple when it comes to, let's say, smartphones. Now, this is probably more applicable a few years ago, but there were many makers of smartphones, but Apple has unique capabilities that gave them a tremendous advantage in terms of design and operating system. And this had a big, big impact on their rivals. So now when we look at all of the 5 forces here, we see that each one of them has a relevance to what we've already covered in class. Like I told you before, with the competitive rivalry within industry, we dealt with this when we talked about measuring market structure, when we talk about HHI, concentration ratio. We're dealing with the competitive rivalry within an industry. What about bargaining power of suppliers? Well, that's an issue of supply and demand, as is bargaining power of, threats of substitutes. We're talking about attributes of demand function, elasticity of demand, switching costs. These are elements we've discussed in class that has to do with this particular force in the 5 forces. And then bargaining power, this is also a supply and demand issue. This is at the demand side. Then threats of new entrants. We talk about threats when we talk about barriers to entry, returns to scale and scope, minimum efficiency of scale. So these are some of the elements we've discussed in class that has to do with this force. So in other words, the 5 forces collectively cover many portions of our class, but they're supposed to say something about the future health of an industry. So this is the main takeaway of the 5 forces. It's been around since the 1980s, and it has a lot to offer in terms of doing some sort of strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats for a particular industry.